Hi, this is Susan Mogensen with Brown Dog Consulting, and welcome to Policy Governance 101, 10 Principles for Effective Boards. To start, we must note that the authoritative source for policy governance is Dr. John Carver and Miriam Carver, and their website is www.carvergovernance.com. The most concise and accurate description of policy governance principles is contained in the Policy Governance Source document, which you can find on the IPGA website. This overview attempts to summarize the contents of the source document. I also want to mention that any discussion about policy governance is going to involve a lot of terms and concepts, for which there's a glossary also located on the IPGA website. Definitely check it out. I think it's really helpful to start by looking at the big picture, like this system diagram, where you have inputs going into the company or organization with the expectation that some positive results, whether it's progress, profit, or a difference in the world, will come out the other end. And to make sure that it all ends up okay, that those results actually match the expectations and investment going into the organization, it's important to realize that boards play a critical role in the sequence of events. And so this is the definition of governance according to Dr. John Carver. He says governance exists to translate the wishes of an organization's owners into organizational performance. So the job of the board of directors is really crucial to make sure it all goes well. But here's the thing, things can get very, very tricky. We assume that board members know what the job of a board member is because they're all such smart, committed people. But that's not always the case. For example, I have seen some very, very experienced corporate board people struggle with this question: what's the difference between a management decision versus a board decision? When something happens, how do we know? Does this belong to the staff or to the board? We also grapple with the problem where the board of directors is ultimately accountable for everything, and yet usually they delegate the accomplishment of results to a CEO or somebody else. How can they delegate and be accountable without micromanaging? We also grapple with the issue that organizations can be very, very complex with lots of decisions that need to be made, lots of values, policies, activities, and programs. How do we get everybody on the same page throughout the organization in a concise, empowering way? The policy governance system really creates a major breakthrough because it resolves all of these questions and so much more. It helps boards really take themselves and their organizations to the next level, and saving people a lot of time and money in the process. All policy governance is a set of 10 principles built on the concept of owner accountability. This presentation will describe these 10 principles very briefly. And there's a picture of my dog Millie with a bunch of policy governance publications. While technically you could choose to use just one or two or a few of the 10 principles, the most benefit that you will achieve is by using the whole system, all 10 principles. When you're using all 10, you basically have an operating system for your board. The first principle of policy governance is that boards are accountable to a legal or moral ownership. Now, all organizations have multiple stakeholders, but boards using policy governance principles determine who are those people to whom we are ultimately accountable. Who are those people on whose behalf we determine the difference the organization is to make in the world? Boards must represent the informed wishes of owners, and they need to know who these owners are so that They know from whom they derive their authority and to whom they are ultimately accountable. We could talk about this principle for a long time, but I'll move on. The second principle speaks to the board's servant leader position in the organization, where they are servants to a legal or moral ownership and leaders of the rest of the organization. As such, they form a link between the ownership and the CEO or management. And any direction that they provide is either going to be aimed at themselves or towards the CEO. Board members are sometimes shocked to learn about this third principle of policy governance, known as the board holism or the one voice principle. It states that board authority is group authority, and so no individual board member has individual authority unless they've been given that by the board as a whole. The one voice aspect refers to the fact that once a board has made a decision, it then directs that decision to the CEO or to subordinates of the board with one voice. There aren't multiple different people giving multiple different directions. It has to be one direction once the board has made that decision. The fourth principle of policy governance tells us what ends are. Ends is a category, one of four, of board policy that describe a benefit, for whom, at what worth or priority. All three of those concepts must be included in the policy at the global level for it to be considered an ends policy. Another way of putting it is to say ends are results for specific beneficiaries and the worth of those results. Note that worth should not be confused with the cost of the means to produce the result, and that ends state the effect of all the things the organization is doing rather than the activities and programs and efforts themselves. Principle number 5 sets out that the board defines how it will operate and behave and how it will connect with operations. So the board gets to decide what committees does it have, what is the responsibility of those committees, what officers will it have, what are their roles, what's a code of conduct going to be or the governing style, who are the owners. All of those decisions find their way in the governance process category of board policy, where the board management delegation category of policy sets up how the board will connect and monitor the operational side of the organization. The sixth principle brings us to the all-empowering executive limitations concept. Executive limitations is a category of board policy in which the board limits operations from doing anything illegal, unethical, and imprudent. Executive limitations are worded proscriptively, and this is empowering because the CEO does not have to bring every decision to the board for approval, but rather we've developed a go until we say stop approach. We've set out boundaries inside executive limitations, inside which ends can be achieved. The seventh principle is about policy sizes. This principle guides boards to develop policies in order from broad to specific. You start off by making a very broad policy statement, and then you gradually break it down. Lower level policies do not introduce new ideas. This principle is handy because it helps to ensure that your policy manual can be comprehensive and concise at the same time. The eighth principle simply sets out the need for delegation clarity and coherence. If the board has a CEO, it considers that person the sole connection between board and operations. And if the board creates a committee, it ensures that that committee's work does not interfere with things that the board has already delegated to the CEO. Number 9 is the any reasonable interpretation principle, which works together with the policy sizes idea and the monitoring principle, which comes next. The any reasonable interpretation concept allows the board to stop writing policy when it feels comfortable with any reasonable interpretation of its words, and is another principle of policy governance which helps to ensure that the board policy manual is as short and concise as possible. If principle number 1 about ownership can be compared to the foundation of a house, principle number 10 could be compared to the roof. This is the board's protection mechanism to ensure that its policies are being followed. And so what happens is the board evaluates organizational performance by regularly checking compliance with a reasonable interpretation of executive limitations and ends. This means that a CEO's internal monitoring report to the board would state, what does the policy say? What is his or her interpretation of that policy? And what's the evidence that shows compliance or non-compliance with that policy? The board also has the option to use direct inspection, where one or more board members check for the evidence of compliance, or an external report in which an external body or person, such as an auditor, will generate the evidence that's in alignment with the interpretation of the policy. Boards benefit in multiple ways when they use all 10 principles of policy governance. They get clear lines of delegation and communication, clear criteria for success. All expectations are pre-stated by the board and policy. Plus, owners are engaged with the board and can see their input translate into results. Furthermore, when all 10 principles are in play, boards and organizations benefit from having a very concise, practical, and comprehensive board policy manual, in which at least something has been said on some level about any possible situation. Staff have the freedom to achieve results, and role clarity means less duplication of effort. And in the end, you get that alignment between the inputs going into the organization and the results coming out the other end. Owner input combined with good information and board member values feed into the board policies, which then get interpreted, which then drive plans and strategies and day-to-day decisions. Everything is connected. For more information, visit www.browndogconsulting.com and check out the resources page. The next step is to do the PG 360 comprehension test and then to join us in a workshop where we put these principles into practice. Thank you for your interest in policy governance. Feel free to contact me anytime.